The moment Cassian Hale stepped inside the rebel stronghold, he could feel their eyes on him. A room full of alphas, betas, and a handful of wary omegas, each one assessing him with open suspicion. A fallen noble. A so-called culled omega. A liability. He squared his shoulders, refusing to shrink under their scrutiny. His whole life had been spent dodging traps, sidestepping power plays, and pretending that the weight of the world didn't rest on his delicate bones. But here, in the heart of the rebel resistance, he was nothing but a prisoner in all but name. "You're a liability," Rowan Alastair's voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. Cassian turned his gaze to him, broad-shouldered, sharp-jawed, and radiating untamed power. The leader of the rebels stood with the confidence of a man who had never bent his knee to anyone. Unlike Cassian, who had spent his life learning to bow. "Or a weapon," Cassian countered, lifting his chin. "That depends on how smart you are." Rowan smirked, a dangerous glint in his storm-gray eyes. He stepped closer, crowding into Cassian's space, his alpha scent curling around them in warning. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Cassian didn't back down. "I know I am." A muscle ticked in Rowan's jaw. He was close now, so close Cassian could feel the heat radiating from his body. His scent was stronger up close, dark cedarwood and something sharper beneath it, something that sent a ripple of unease through Cassian's gut. "You don't belong here, Omega." Rowan's voice dropped lower, rougher. "You think you can play politics with us? That you can survive in the real world without your silken robes and golden cage?" Cassian's fingers curled into fists, nails biting into his palms. "I survived the culling. I think I can handle a few rebels." Rowan's lips curled at the corners. Then, with slow, deliberate intent, he lifted a hand and traced a single finger along Cassian's jawline. The touch was barely there, a whisper of skin against skin, but Cassian felt it everywhere. He hated the way his breath caught. Rowan's smirk deepened. "We'll see." Rowan tested him. Constantly. It started small, a brush of fingers when he passed, a hand lingering on Cassian's lower back when they walked together. Subtle, deliberate, taunting. Like a predator testing its prey. Cassian refused to react. But Rowan pushed. At dinner, when Cassian reached for a bowl of food, Rowan's hand came down on his wrist, firm and unyielding. Cassian froze, meeting those sharp gray eyes. "You need permission, little noble?" Rowan murmured, voice laced with amusement. Cassian bared his teeth in a smile. "From you? Never." Rowan didn't let go. If anything, his grip tightened, his thumb ghosting over Cassian's pulse, slow and knowing. Cassian felt the heat coil in his stomach before he forced himself to jerk his arm away. The other rebels were watching. Rowan only smirked. Bastard. The mission went wrong. Cassian found himself fleeing through the forest, mud splattered on his clothes, adrenaline pounding in his ears. Rowan was ahead of him, cutting through the undergrowth like a beast born of the wild. "Move faster," Rowan snapped, grabbing Cassian's arm and yanking him forward, his grip bruising. Cassian nearly stumbled into him. "I can keep up, you overgrown." An arrow whizzed past his ear. Rowan shoved him against a tree, pressing close, shielding him with his body. Cassian's breath stuttered. "Shut up and stay still," Rowan growled, voice dangerously close to his ear. Cassian swallowed hard. The press of Rowan's chest against his back was solid, burning through his clothes. The warmth of his breath ghosted over Cassian's neck. His instincts screamed at him to push away. But another part of him, a darker, traitorous part, wanted to lean in. Rowan turned his head slightly, his lips just inches from Cassian's skin. "Are you scared, little noble?" His voice was quieter now, a dangerous whisper. Cassian clenched his jaw. "Not of you." A pause. Then Rowan's lips curved against the shell of his ear. "Liar." The cabin was small and cold, tucked deep into the mountains. Snow clung to Cassian's lashes as they stumbled inside, breathless. Rowan was already stripping off his damp cloak, tossing it aside. "We need to get warm." Cassian rubbed his arms, shivering. He hated the way his body ached for warmth, hated that Rowan was the only source of it. Rowan sighed and, before Cassian could protest, gripped his shoulders and pulled him close. Cassian's breath hitched. "What the hell are you?" "Shut up." Rowan's voice was low, rough. "You'll freeze." The heat of him was overwhelming. Cassian's hands instinctively pressed against Rowan's chest, but he didn't push away. Rowan's arms tightened around him, one hand resting between his shoulder blades, the other at his waist. It was wrong. It was necessary. It was intoxicating. Cassian tilted his head slightly, just enough that his forehead brushed against Rowan's collarbone. He felt Rowan exhale, felt the way his grip tensed ever so slightly, as if restraining himself. Then, Rowan's fingers traced down Cassian's spine, slow, deliberate, torturously light. Cassian shivered, but not from the cold. Rowan chuckled, a dark sound. "Ah, so you do feel something." Cassian's nails dug into his shirt. "Shut up." Rowan didn't let go, and Cassian didn't move away. By the time they reached the rebel base again, something had changed. Cassian felt it in the way Rowan watched him, in the way Rowan's touch lingered longer than before, in the way his own body betrayed him. It all came to a head when Rowan cornered him in the hall. Cassian barely had time to react before Rowan pressed a hand to the wall beside his head, caging him in. "You're avoiding me," Rowan murmured, voice velvet dark. Cassian scoffed. "Don't flatter yourself." But his pulse betrayed him. Rowan's gaze flickered to his throat, where his heartbeat thrummed wildly. His scent darkened, filling the space between them. Then he leaned in, his nose brushing Cassian's jaw. Cassian sucked in a breath. Rowan's voice was a whisper now. "I think you like the chase, little noble." Cassian turned his head, barely suppressing a shiver as their lips almost brushed. Rowan smirked. And then, deliberately, he pulled away. Cassian was left standing there, breathless, furious, and wanting. The rebel hideout was quiet, save for the occasional whisper of wind against the stone walls. Most of the others had retired for the night, leaving the corridors dimly lit by flickering lanterns. But rest refused to come, his body too aware, too restless. And he knew why. Rowan. The infuriating alpha had gotten under his skin. Every lingering glance, every casual touch, every low-spoken taunt, it was all a game to him. One Cassian knew he should never play. He wasn't naive. He had grown up surrounded by men who wanted to claim, to control, to own. And yet, Rowan was different. He wasn't just a brute looking to dominate an Omega. He was something far worse. A man who wanted to make him want it. And that terrified him. Cassian exhaled sharply, shoving off the thin blanket, his body thrumming with frustrated energy. He needed to cool off, to put distance between himself and the thoughts creeping into his mind. He stepped out of his room, his bare feet silent against the cold stone floor. The corridor was empty, the rebel base wrapped in the hush of night. He barely made it past the first turn before he felt it. A presence. Heat curled against his back before he even saw him. Rowan. Cassian froze, heart lurching into his throat as a voice brushed against his ear. "You shouldn't be wandering alone." A shiver rippled down his spine, but he masked it with irritation, turning to face him. Rowan stood there, his tall frame bathed in shadows, his gray eyes unreadable in the dim light. "I wasn't aware I needed a guard," Cassian said smoothly, arms crossing over his chest. Rowan didn't move, but his gaze dipped, slow and deliberate, taking in every inch of him. Cassian suddenly became aware of his thin nightshirt, the fabric whispering over his skin, doing little to shield him from the weight of that stare. Rowan smirked. "Maybe you do." Cassian's jaw tightened. "If you're here to test my patience, congratulations, you've succeeded." Rowan took a step closer, the heat of his body invading Cassian's space. Not touching, but close enough to steal the air between them. "Why are you really awake, little noble?" Rowan murmured. "Something keeping you up?" Cassian clenched his fists, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. "If I said you were the problem, would you leave?" Rowan chuckled, low and deep. "Not a chance." The tension between them thickened, charged with something dangerous, something unspoken. Cassian's instincts screamed at him to walk away. But he didn't. He should have. Because Rowan moved. One step. Until the wall was at Cassian's back, and Rowan was in front of him, bracing a hand beside his head. Cassian's breath caught. "Tell me to leave." Rowan's voice was quiet, rough. "Tell me, and I will." Cassian opened his mouth, but no words came. Because the truth was he didn't want Rowan to move away. He hated the way his body responded, the way warmth coiled deep in his stomach, the way his fingers itched to grab, to pull, to take. Rowan must have seen it in his eyes, because his smirk faded. His fingers skated down, barely touching Cassian's wrist, a ghost of a touch that sent fire licking up his arm. "Careful, Cassian," Rowan murmured, voice like velvet. "You're starting to look like you want me to stay." Cassian hated him. Hated that he was right. He should push him away. Should walk away. But instead, he grabbed the front of Rowan's shirt, yanking him forward, their lips crashing together. Rowan growled, a deep, primal sound, as if he'd been waiting for this, as if he'd known Cassian would break first. He pressed forward, his body flush against Cassian's, trapping him against the wall. Cassian gasped against his mouth, but Rowan took advantage, deepening the kiss, his tongue brushing against Cassian's lower lip, demanding more. Cassian had kissed before. He had played at passion, at seduction. But nothing had ever felt like this. Like losing control. Like falling. Rowan's hands gripped Cassian's hips, rough, unyielding, as if grounding him. As if he already knew Cassian was coming undone. A sharp nip at his lower lip made Cassian gasp, and Rowan pulled back just enough to murmur, "Still think you don't need a guard?" Cassian's breath was ragged. His fingers still curled into Rowan's shirt. He could end this now. He could push away, say it was a mistake, pretend the ache in his chest wasn't real. But he didn't. Because for the first time in years, he didn't want to pretend. And Rowan knew it. So when Rowan kissed him again, slower this time, deeper, Cassian let himself fall. Cassian should have left. The moment Rowan's lips left his, when the heat of the kiss still lingered like a burn on his skin, he should have put distance between them. Should have turned on his heel, straightened his spine, and pretended like nothing had happened. But he didn't. He couldn't. His body was still pressed against the cold stone wall, his breath uneven, his pulse frantic beneath his skin. And Rowan stood in front of him, his own breathing just as ragged, his pupils blown wide, a predator who had tasted something forbidden and now craved more. Neither of them moved. Seconds stretched between them, heavy and taut, the air charged with something thick and unspoken. Cassian's fingers twitched at his sides, his body aching with a need he didn't dare name. Rowan's voice was quiet when he finally spoke. "Say the word, Cassian. Tell me to stop." Cassian swallowed, his throat dry. His rational mind screamed at him to end this now, to shove Rowan away before he fell too far. But instead, his hands moved before his thoughts could catch up. Fingers curling into the fabric of Rowan's shirt, gripping tight. He didn't push him away. He pulled him closer. Rowan exhaled sharply, a curse slipping past his lips before his mouth crashed onto Cassian's again. There was nothing hesitant this time. No careful teasing. It was a claiming, a raw, unfiltered hunger that made Cassian's head spin. Teeth scraped against his lower lip. Hands slid over his waist, pressing him back against the wall, trapping him completely. Cassian gasped into the kiss, and Rowan took the opportunity to deepen it, tilting Cassian's head back, his tongue sweeping past parted lips. Cassian's fingers tightened in Rowan's shirt, holding on like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. Heat coiled low in his stomach, spreading like fire through his veins, making him light-headed and desperate. Rowan's mouth left his lips only to drag along his jaw, down to the sensitive skin beneath his ear. A warm breath ghosted over his throat before, a slow, open-mouthed kiss, teeth barely scraping. Cassian shuddered. He should stop this. He knew he should. But Rowan's hands slid lower, fingers curling against the curve of his hips, tugging him forward until there was no space left between them. Cassian bit his lip, stifling a sound. Rowan must have felt his hesitation, because he stilled. His breath was uneven against Cassian's neck, his grip firm but not unyielding. "Tell me to stop," Rowan murmured again, his voice rough, strained. His control hung by a thread, and Cassian could feel it. But Cassian didn't say anything. Instead, his hands moved, trailing up Rowan's arms, over the sharp ridges of his shoulders, his fingers curling around the nape of his neck. And then, just as Rowan had done to him, he pulled him closer. That was all it took. Rowan made a sound low in his throat, something almost pained, and then his mouth was on Cassian's again. Hot, desperate, insatiable. Cassian had never been kissed like this. Like the air between them was charged, like every touch sent lightning down his spine. Rowan's hands skimmed over his back, his grip both careful and possessive, as if mapping every inch of him. Cassian let himself melt into it, let himself be lost in the heat, the rough drag of Rowan's hands, the dizzying pressure of his lips. But then Rowan pulled back. Cassian's head spun from the sudden loss of warmth, his breath ragged. "What?" Rowan's forehead rested against his breath uneven. "If we don't stop now, I won't be able to." Cassian swallowed hard, his chest rising and falling rapidly. His mind was a storm, his body alight with lingering heat, with need. But Rowan was right. Cassian forced himself to release his grip, his fingers slipping from Rowan's neck, from his shirt. He took a step back, creating space between them, even though every part of him screamed against it. They stood there in silence, both struggling to regain control. And then Rowan exhaled, a soft laugh escaping his lips. "You're dangerous, little noble." Cassian smirked, despite the flush on his skin. "You're the one who followed me, Rowan." Rowan chuckled, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah. And I'll probably regret that for the rest of the night." Cassian let out a slow breath, still trying to calm his pulse. He glanced toward the corridor leading back to his room. "Good night, Rowan." Rowan didn't move as Cassian stepped past him, but before he disappeared down the hall, Rowan's voice reached him once more, soft, husky. "Good night, Cassian." Cassian didn't turn around. Because if he did, he wasn't sure he'd be able to walk away again. The heat of Rowan's touch lingered on his skin, a ghost of sensation that refused to fade. No matter how many times he turned over in bed, how tightly he shut his eyes, the memory of Rowan's lips, his hands, his breath against his throat burned into his thoughts. It was infuriating. The castle was silent around him, the only sound his own unsteady breathing. His chest ached, his body restless with something he refused to name. He wasn't sure if it was frustration or desire, or maybe both. He threw off the covers with a quiet curse and sat up. Cool air kissed his overheated skin, but it did nothing to ease the storm inside him. He needed to clear his head. Cassian left his chambers, padding barefoot through the dimly lit corridors. The stone beneath his feet was cold, grounding. He focused on the rhythm of his steps, on the distant flicker of torchlight down the hall. But then he saw him. Rowan stood at the far end of the corridor, leaning against the stone wall, arms crossed over his chest. His golden-brown hair was disheveled, his shirt half-buttoned, like he had been just as restless. His gaze locked onto Cassian immediately, something dark and unreadable in his eyes. Cassian's breath caught. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, thick and charged, the tension between them palpable. Cassian should have turned back, should have walked away. Instead, he took a step forward. "So," Rowan murmured, his voice rough. "Couldn't sleep either?" Cassian swallowed hard. "No." Rowan pushed off the wall, closing the distance between them in slow, deliberate steps. The flickering torchlight cast shadows over his sharp features, highlighting the tension in his jaw. And then he was standing right in front of him, too close, his presence overwhelming. "You left too quickly," Rowan murmured. Cassian's heart pounded. "You told me to." A smirk tugged at Rowan's lips, but there was something unreadable in his expression. Something hesitant. His fingers twitched at his sides, like he was holding himself back. Cassian didn't know what possessed him to do it. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was the fire burning beneath his skin, but he reached out, his fingers grazing Rowan's wrist. Rowan tensed. Cassian didn't pull away. Instead, he let his touch linger, barely there, the warmth of Rowan's skin seeping into his own. Rowan exhaled sharply. It was the only warning Cassian got before Rowan moved. Quick, precise, like a hunter finally claiming his prey. Cassian barely had time to react before his back hit the cold stone wall, Rowan's body pressing against his. A sharp inhale left Cassian's lips. Rowan's hands braced on either side of him, caging him in. The heat between them was unbearable, a fire that neither of them could ignore. "You're playing a dangerous game, Cassian," Rowan murmured, his voice low. Cassian's lips parted, his breath uneven. "I think we're both playing." Rowan's eyes darkened. And then, a hand slid up Cassian's arm, slow, teasing, fingers barely brushing over his skin. Cassian shivered at the touch, his body betraying him, leaning into it before he could stop himself. Rowan's fingers traced up, over his shoulder, his neck, before stopping at his jaw. He tilted Cassian's chin up slightly, forcing their gazes to lock. Cassian's pulse pounded beneath Rowan's touch. "You drive me insane," Rowan muttered. Cassian smirked, though his voice was breathless. "Good." Rowan let out a low chuckle, but there was no humor in it, only tension, only heat. Then, without another word, he leaned in. Cassian had expected the kiss to be rough, all fire and recklessness, but Rowan surprised him. His lips brushed against Cassian's in a slow, agonizingly gentle way, like he was savoring every second, every breath between them. Cassian's hands curled into the fabric of Rowan's shirt, pulling him closer, needing more. Rowan obliged. The kiss deepened, growing more intense, more demanding. Teeth scraped, tongues tangled, every movement pushing them further into the fire. Cassian felt lightheaded, overwhelmed, lost in the sheer sensation of Rowan's touch. One of Rowan's hands slid down, fingers grazing over Cassian's waist, his grip firm, possessive. Cassian gasped into the kiss, and Rowan took the opportunity to tilt his head back, trailing kisses down his throat. Slow. Unhurried. A silent torment. Cassian bit his lip, stifling a sound. His head spun. Rowan's mouth brushed against the sensitive skin just below his ear, his breath warm, teasing. Cassian's fingers tightened in Rowan's shirt. "You." Rowan hummed in amusement against his skin. "Problem," he murmured, his lips barely ghosting over Cassian's pulse point. Cassian gritted his teeth, refusing to give him the satisfaction of an answer. Rowan chuckled. The sound was deep, knowing, entirely too pleased with himself. Cassian hated how much he liked it. Rowan pulled back just enough to meet Cassian's gaze again. And then, with maddening slowness, he took a step back, putting space between them. Cassian's body screamed at the loss of contact, his breath still uneven. Rowan smirked. He knew exactly what he was doing. Cassian scowled, trying to regain his composure. "You're insufferable." Rowan grinned. "And yet, you keep letting me close." Cassian narrowed his eyes. "Don't push your luck." Rowan chuckled, reaching out to brush a stray lock of hair from Cassian's face. The touch was fleeting, almost tender. Cassian hated how much his heart stuttered at the simple gesture. Rowan sighed, raking a hand through his hair. "We should go back before someone sees us." Cassian hesitated but nodded. As he turned to leave, Rowan's voice stopped him. "Cassian." He glanced over his shoulder. Rowan's gaze was unreadable, but something in his expression softened. "Good night." Cassian swallowed. "Good night, Rowan." This time, he didn't look back. Because if he did, he wasn't sure if he'd be able to walk away. Cassian barely made it back to his chambers before the weight of what had just happened crashed over him. His lips still tingled from Rowan's kiss. His skin burned where Rowan had touched him, where fingers had traced, where breath had ghosted over sensitive places. He ran a shaky hand through his hair and exhaled sharply. This was reckless. Dangerous. He knew that. And yet... Cassian collapsed onto his bed, staring up at the ceiling, his heart pounding, his body still thrumming with something raw and unsatisfied. Rowan had left him wanting more, knowing full well he had the upper hand. It was infuriating. He wasn't supposed to want this. Rowan was the enemy. He had spent years keeping his guard up, refusing to let anyone get close. And yet, in the span of a few weeks, Rowan had torn down every carefully built wall with nothing but a smirk and a knowing gaze. Cassian hated him for it, but not as much as he hated himself for letting it happen. The next morning, Cassian didn't expect to see Rowan so soon, but fate had other plans. Breakfast in the great hall was unusually quiet, the morning sun filtering through tall windows, casting golden light across the long wooden tables. The scent of warm bread and freshly brewed tea filled the air, but Cassian barely tasted anything. He sat at the far end of the table, trying to avoid any attention. But his entire body tensed the moment Rowan strode in, like he owned the damn place. His presence was impossible to ignore. Cassian forced himself to focus on the food in front of him, but it was no use. Rowan was a force of nature, drawing his attention no matter how hard he fought it. And Rowan knew it. He settled into the seat directly across from Cassian with a lazy smirk, as if nothing had happened the night before. Cassian clenched his jaw. Rowan tilted his head, watching him. "You're quiet this morning." Cassian didn't look up. "Maybe I just don't have anything to say to you." A soft chuckle. "Oh, I doubt that." Cassian's fingers curled around the silverware, fighting the urge to throw something at him. Rowan leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to something quieter, just for him. "You left so quickly last night. I was almost offended." Cassian's grip tightened. "Not everything revolves around you, Rowan." Rowan hummed in amusement. "No, but I do seem to take up a lot of your thoughts." Cassian shot him a glare, but the bastard only grinned wider. Before Cassian could snap back, someone cleared their throat nearby. "A word, Cassian?" Cassian turned to see Silas standing beside him, arms crossed. His expression was unreadable, but his sharp gaze flickered between the two of them for a fraction of a second. Rowan leaned back in his chair, his smirk fading slightly. "By all means," he said, gesturing toward the door. Cassian hesitated, then pushed back his chair and stood. Silas didn't say a word as they left the hall, but Cassian could feel the weight of his unspoken thoughts. Finally, once they were far enough from prying ears, Silas stopped and turned to him. "What exactly are you doing?" Cassian crossed his arms. "I'm having breakfast." Silas didn't look amused. "With him." Cassian exhaled slowly. "I don't need a lecture, Silas." "You need someone to knock some sense into you," Silas shot back. "He's not one of us, Cassian." Cassian stiffened. "I know that." Silas studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "Then act like it." Cassian looked away. He wanted to argue, but what was the point? Silas wasn't wrong. Later that night, Cassian knew he should have stayed in his room. He knew it was reckless, stupid, and exactly what Silas had warned him against. But he didn't stop himself. His feet carried him through the dimly lit corridors, past the empty hallways, and toward the secluded wing where Rowan stayed. He wasn't even sure what he was going to say when he got there. But the moment he reached Rowan's door, it swung open before he could knock. Cassian barely had time to react before Rowan grabbed him by the wrist and yanked him inside. The door slammed shut behind them. Cassian turned sharply, ready to demand an explanation, but Rowan was already too close, his golden eyes filled with something unreadable. "You shouldn't be here," Rowan murmured. Cassian swallowed hard. "Then let me go." Rowan's grip didn't loosen. If anything, his fingers tightened just slightly, his thumb brushing over Cassian's pulse. Cassian hated how his body responded to something so simple. "I don't think you want that," Rowan said softly. Cassian's breath caught. The air between them shifted, thick with something dangerous, something neither of them wanted to name. Rowan's free hand lifted, fingers brushing over Cassian's jaw. "You keep running." Cassian tensed. "I'm not running." Rowan's lips curved into something knowing. "No." Cassian opened his mouth to argue, but the words never came. Because Rowan leaned in, his breath ghosting over Cassian's lips, his presence overwhelming. Cassian should have pushed him away. He didn't. Rowan's fingers traced lower, barely skimming over the sensitive skin at Cassian's throat, then lower, dragging over his collarbone, his touch maddeningly light. Cassian let out a sharp breath, his head tilting back slightly. Rowan took it as an invitation. His lips brushed against Cassian's neck, slow and deliberate, pressing soft, teasing kisses against sensitive skin. Cassian's hands curled into fists. You. Rowan hummed against his skin. Problem. Cassian bit back a curse. Rowan's mouth trailed lower, lips barely grazing over the edge of Cassian's shirt, then moving back up, slow, unhurried, savoring every reaction. Cassian's breathing was uneven now, his body betraying him. Rowan finally pulled back just enough to meet his gaze, his golden eyes dark with satisfaction. "You're impossible," Cassian muttered. Rowan smirked. "And yet, here you are." Cassian hated that he was right. Rowan's fingers brushed over his lips, a touch so light it was almost a whisper. Then, just as quickly as he had pulled him in, Rowan stepped back. Cassian's body protested the loss of warmth, of contact. Rowan tilted his head. "You should go before you do something reckless." Cassian's heart pounded. "You're the reckless one." Rowan smiled. "That's why you like me." Cassian glared. But he didn't deny it. And that was the worst part. He lay awake long after he left Rowan's chambers, his body still humming from the maddening, intoxicating touch of the enemy he couldn't seem to resist. His mind was at war with itself, half of him screaming that this was dangerous, reckless, a mistake, while the other half ached for more. He told himself it was just the tension of their circumstances, the proximity, the way Rowan looked at him like he was something worth chasing. But Cassian knew better. This was more than just tension. And that was the problem. The next morning, Cassian was exhausted when he entered the training grounds, but he forced himself to push through it. The courtyard was alive with movement, soldiers sparring, weapons clashing, orders being shouted. Cassian focused on his footwork, his breathing, the familiar rhythm of his blade in his hand. But then he saw Rowan. The Alpha was across the yard, dressed in loose fighting leathers, his sword resting lazily on his shoulder as he smirked at the soldier in front of him. Cassian tried to ignore him. He failed. Rowan was fighting someone from Cassian's unit, a seasoned warrior, bigger and stronger. It should have been a fair match. It wasn't. Rowan moved like a shadow, effortless, fluid, and ruthless all at once. His opponent barely got the chance to swing before Rowan had disarmed him, spun him around, and knocked him flat on his back. Cassian scowled. He should have looked away. He didn't. Rowan caught his stare from across the courtyard, his golden eyes dark with amusement. He smirked, as if he could hear every single thought racing through Cassian's mind. Cassian rolled his eyes and turned back to his own sparring partner. He lasted 3 moves before Rowan strolled over. "Care for a match?" Rowan asked, voice dripping with challenge. Cassian gritted his teeth. "I'm busy." Rowan ignored him and stepped closer, his smirk widening. "Afraid I'll embarrass you in front of your men?" Cassian wanted to punch him. Instead, he threw down his practice blade and grabbed a real sword from the nearby rack. Rowan grinned. The fight. They circled each other slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down like a storm about to break. Cassian struck first, a quick, sharp attack meant to test Rowan's reflexes. Rowan dodged too easily. Cassian narrowed his eyes and swung again, faster this time. Rowan blocked, his grip steady, his footwork sharp. They clashed over and over, their blades a blur of silver in the morning light. Every strike was precise, every dodge calculated. The crowd around them grew, but Cassian barely noticed. All he saw was Rowan. Rowan, who fought like this was nothing but a game. Rowan, who met his every attack with infuriating ease. Rowan, who suddenly surged forward, breaking through Cassian's guard, twisting their bodies until he had Cassian pinned against a wooden post, one hand gripping his wrist, the other pressed against his chest. Their breathing was ragged, their bodies flush against each other. Cassian could feel the heat radiating from him, the steady thrum of Rowan's pulse beneath his fingertips. Rowan's gaze flickered to Cassian's lips for the briefest second before he smirked. "Yield," he murmured. Cassian's entire body tensed. The bastard. He knew exactly what he was doing. And worse, he was enjoying it. Cassian hated how his breath hitched, how his body reacted without his permission. But he wasn't about to let Rowan win. So instead of yielding, he shifted his weight just slightly, then swept Rowan's legs out from under him. Rowan hit the ground hard, his smirk vanishing in an instant. Cassian stepped over him, sword at his throat. "Not so cocky now, are you?" Rowan let out a breathless laugh. "I knew you had it in you." Cassian didn't move. His pulse was still racing, but not from the fight. From something else entirely. The air between them was thick, too thick, charged with something they both refused to name. And that's when Silas arrived. The interruption. Cassian. The sound of his name snapped him back to reality. Silas stood at the edge of the training ground, arms crossed, face unreadable. Cassian stepped back immediately, sheathing his sword. Rowan, still on the ground, looked up at Silas, then back at Cassian. He smirked. "Looks like you've got company." Cassian shot him a glare before turning to Silas. "What is it?" Silas didn't answer right away. His gaze flickered between Cassian and Rowan, sharp, calculating. Then he exhaled. "We need to talk. Now." Cassian nodded stiffly and followed him out of the yard. As they walked, Silas didn't speak. Not until they were out of earshot. Then, finally, he turned to Cassian, his expression unreadable. "What the hell are you doing?" Cassian frowned. "What are you talking about?" Silas gave him a flat look. "Don't play dumb. You think I haven't noticed? The way you look at him. The way he looks at you." Cassian's stomach twisted. Silas continued, voice low and dangerous. "He's not one of us, Cassian. He's dangerous. You know that." Cassian clenched his jaw. "I don't need you to tell me that." Silas scoffed. "Then start acting like it." Cassian turned away, frustration and something else burning beneath his skin. He knew Silas was right. He knew Rowan was dangerous. But God's help him, he didn't care. That night, Cassian should have stayed in his room. He should have listened to Silas. But instead, he found himself standing outside Rowan's door. Before he could knock, Rowan opened it, leaning casually against the frame, like he'd been expecting him. "Couldn't stay away, could you?" Cassian wanted to slap that smirk off his face. Instead, he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Rowan raised an eyebrow. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Cassian didn't answer. He was too busy crossing the room, grabbing Rowan by the collar, and pulling him into a bruising, breath-stealing kiss. Rowan made a surprised sound, but it quickly melted into something deeper, something darker. Their bodies pressed together, heat sparking between them like wildfire. Rowan's hand slid over Cassian's back, up his neck, into his hair, gripping, pulling, owning. Cassian groaned into the kiss, losing himself in the intoxicating feel of it, in the way Rowan tasted, in the way he touched him like he was something precious and breakable all at once. They broke apart, panting, foreheads pressed together. Rowan's voice was rough when he spoke. "You sure you want this?" Cassian's answer was a whisper against his lips. "I think I stopped having a choice a long time ago. A throne of lies." Cassian didn't sleep that night. Not because of regret. He wasn't sure he was capable of regret when it came to Rowan anymore. But because the moment he left Rowan's chambers, the weight of reality crashed down on him like a collapsing fortress. He'd crossed a line. A dangerous, irreversible line. And he wasn't sure which was worse, that he had done it, or that he wanted to do it again. The council's verdict. The next morning, Cassian was summoned. The war council met in a candlelit chamber beneath the fortress, a place of secrecy, whispers, and blood-stained decisions. Cassian stood before them, his heart pounding, his hands clenched at his sides. Silas was there, watching him with narrowed eyes. Did he know? Did he see the way Cassian had crumbled last night? Did he sense that he was unraveling, thread by thread, beneath Rowan's touch? At the head of the table, Lord Eridan, the true power behind their rebellion, folded his hands. His face was a mask of quiet cruelty. "We have made our decision," he said, voice like ice. Cassian steeled himself. "The prince dies at dawn." The words barely registered. It took a second too long for the meaning to sink in, for the weight of them to crash into Cassian's chest.
No, 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 no.
He forced himself to speak, his voice hoarse. You can't. Lord Eridan arched an eyebrow. I assure you we can. Cassian clenched his fists. We still need him. We needed him, Eridan corrected. Past tense. Cassian's breath came too fast. You said we would use him as leverage. Silas cut in sharply. Plans change, Cassian. Cassian turned to him, betrayal carving into his ribs like a blade. You knew about this? Silas held his gaze. He's a risk. Cassian felt the walls closing in. Rowan was a prisoner, a captive of war. Not an execution waiting to happen. Cassian should have seen this coming. He should have known. The rebellion didn't just want to take the throne. They wanted to burn the monarchy to the ground. And that included killing its last heir. Eridan's voice was cold. You are dismissed. Cassian didn't move. He couldn't. Not when the boy he had kissed last night, the one who had pulled him apart and put him back together with nothing but a smirk and the heat of his touch, was about to die. The escape plan. Cassian didn't know how he made it back to his quarters without falling apart. All he knew was that he had until dawn. One night. One night to figure out how to break the Crown Prince out of the most heavily guarded prison in the rebellion's stronghold. One night to betray everything he'd fought for. One night to decide which part of him he was willing to destroy. He paced his room, his mind racing. There were guards, too many to fight alone. There were walls, thick and cold and lined with steel. But there were weaknesses. Cassian had spent years studying this fortress, and he was about to tear it apart from the inside. The descent. Nightfall came too soon. Cassian moved like a shadow, slipping through corridors, past guards, through hidden pathways known only to the highest-ranking rebels. By the time he reached the lower dungeons, his heart was pounding. Rowan sat in his cell, arms bound behind him, shirt torn, bruises shadowing his ribs. He looked up as Cassian entered. And then, he smirked. Took you long enough. Cassian ignored the sharp twist in his chest. Even now, even knowing he was about to die, Rowan was still Rowan. Still arrogant. Still reckless. Still the only thing Cassian wanted. He knelt beside him, hands working at the iron cuffs. Rowan watched him closely. This is treason, you know. Cassian gritted his teeth. Shut up. Rowan tilted his head. And here I thought you were one of them. Cassian's fingers faltered. He should have been. He had spent his whole life fighting against the crown, against everything Rowan stood for. And yet, he was here. Saving him. Destroying everything he had believed in. Rowan's voice softened. Why are you doing this? Cassian didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead, he yanked the cuffs free and grabbed Rowan's hand, pulling him to his feet. Rowan stumbled, but Cassian caught him, one hand bracing his back, the other pressing against his chest. Too close. Too much. Cassian should have let go. But he didn't. For one brief, reckless second, he let himself stay. Rowan's breath was warm against his skin. His pulse, steady beneath Cassian's fingers. His lips. Cassian, Rowan murmured. If you don't let go, we're going to die. Cassian inhaled sharply, tearing himself away. He turned toward the door, heart hammering. Follow me. The escape. They moved through the corridors in silence. Guards were stationed at every turn, but Cassian knew this fortress better than anyone. He led Rowan through hidden paths, through tunnels no one had used in years. They were close, so close, when it all fell apart. A shout rang out. Footsteps thundered behind them. They had been caught. Cassian grabbed Rowan's wrist and ran. Down the hallway, through a side passage, up a winding staircase. And then, Silas stood at the top of the stairs. Sword drawn. Expression unreadable. Cassian skidded to a stop, Rowan panting beside him. Silas' voice was quiet. Too quiet. You really are a fool, aren't you? Cassian swallowed hard. Silas. But Silas didn't wait. He lunged. The next few seconds blurred, steel meeting steel, blades clashing in the dim torchlight. Silas fought like a man betrayed. Because that's exactly what he was. Cassian barely kept up, parrying blows, dodging sharp, brutal strikes. Behind him, Rowan moved, grabbing a fallen dagger. A sharp pain tore through Cassian's ribs. Silas had cut him. Not deep, but enough to make him stumble. Enough to make him hesitate. Silas raised his sword for the final strike. Rowan moved first. The dagger sank into Silas' side. His eyes widened. A sharp breath, a single step back, then he crumpled. Cassian stared. Rowan met his gaze. Neither of them spoke. Then, Rowan grabbed Cassian's arm. "We need to go." Cassian hesitated, just for a moment. Silas was his friend. His brother in arms. And he was bleeding out on the stone floor. But Cassian didn't move to help him. Because Rowan was right. They had to run. So he did. He turned away, ignoring the sharp, shattering pain in his chest. And as they disappeared into the darkness, Cassian realized. There was no going back. He had just become the very thing he once swore to destroy. The storm had yet to let up. The sky rumbled in protest, sheets of rain cascading over the ruined temple where Rowan stood, his sword drawn. His damp cloak clung to his form, the fabric heavy with water, but his focus remained unwavering. Cassian had come for him. Despite everything, the rebels, the war, the tangled web of betrayal, Cassian had still run through the storm for him. And that was dangerous. Cassian pressed his back against the stone, breath heavy, his heart hammering against his ribs. The Queen's forces weren't far behind. He could hear the distant clang of steel, the shouts of men searching the woods. "We don't have much time," Rowan murmured, stepping closer. Cassian turned to face him. "Then we need to leave. Now." Rowan hesitated. "And go where?" "Anywhere but here." A muscle ticked in Rowan's jaw. "Cassian, if you leave with me now, there's no going back." Cassian exhaled sharply. He had already made his choice the moment he ran to Rowan instead of the rebels. "I know." Something shifted in Rowan's gaze, something dark and unreadable. His fingers twitched at his side as if warring with himself. Then, in one swift movement, he reached for Cassian's wrist, pulling him close. "You shouldn't have come for me," Rowan murmured. Cassian swallowed. "And yet I did." The tension between them crackled like lightning, raw and volatile. The rain slicked their skin, their breaths mingling in the cold air. "You're reckless," Rowan muttered. Cassian huffed a quiet laugh. "Takes one to know one." And then Rowan kissed him. It wasn't soft. It wasn't hesitant. It was fire meeting fire, a collision of desperation and unspoken words. Rowan's hand tangled in Cassian's wet hair, tugging him closer, while Cassian gripped the front of Rowan's tunic like he was afraid to let go. The world around them faded, the storm, the battle, the looming war. For this stolen moment, nothing else existed. Rowan's lips moved against his with purpose, his grip firm as if trying to brand the feeling into his skin. Cassian shivered as Rowan's fingers traced the curve of his neck, his touch sending sparks down his spine. Then, a crash in the distance, a reminder of reality. Rowan broke the kiss, chest heaving. "We have to go." Cassian nodded, though his body screamed in protest. "Right. Moving. Let's go." Rowan sheathed his sword and took Cassian's hand without hesitation, their fingers lacing together. And together, they ran, into the storm, into the unknown, into whatever came next. The rain had eased into a cold drizzle by the time Rowan and Cassian reached the abandoned watchtower deep within the forest. It loomed above them like a forgotten relic, its stone walls covered in moss, its wooden doors barely holding together. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. Rowan pushed the door open and stepped inside first, sword still drawn. Cassian followed, his body thrumming with exhaustion and something else, something far more dangerous. They were alone now. The air between them was thick, charged with everything that had just happened. The desperation, The choices they had made, the undeniable pull between them. Cassian shivered, not from the cold, but from the weight of it all. Rowan turned to him, eyes dark with something unreadable. "You shouldn't have come for me," Rowan said again, quieter this time, almost like a confession. Cassian met his gaze without hesitation. "And yet I did." Rowan exhaled sharply. He looked torn, as if he were fighting something inside himself, something dangerous. "You don't get it, do you?" Rowan murmured, stepping closer. "The moment you ran into that storm, the moment you chose me, you sealed your fate." Cassian held his ground, tilting his chin up. "Then so be it." The tension between them ignited like dry tinder meeting a flame. Rowan closed the distance in a heartbeat, backing Cassian against the cold stone wall. His hand braced beside Cassian's head, trapping him there, their bodies just inches apart. Cassian's breath caught in his throat. The heat between them was suffocating, intoxicating. "You don't know what you're doing," Rowan murmured, his voice lower now, rougher. Cassian smirked, though his pulse was erratic. "Then show me." A sharp inhale. Then, Rowan kissed him. It wasn't soft or careful. It was wildfire, reckless and consuming, months of tension unraveling all at once. Cassian's hands found Rowan's rain-soaked tunic, gripping it as if to anchor himself. Rowan's fingers threaded into Cassian's hair, tugging, deepening the kiss until Cassian was drowning in it. The world blurred. All that mattered was this: Rowan's lips on his, the warmth of his body pressing against him, the way their breaths tangled between gasps. Rowan pulled away just enough to rest his forehead against Cassian's, both of them breathing hard. "This is dangerous," Rowan whispered. Cassian swallowed. "Everything about us is." A muscle in Rowan's jaw ticked. "And yet, you keep choosing me." Cassian let out a breathless laugh. "I'm not the only one choosing." Rowan didn't respond. Not with words. Instead, he crushed his lips to Cassian's again, as if trying to make him understand without speaking. The storm outside had passed, but inside this tower, the fire was only beginning to burn. The fire crackled in the old hearth, its embers casting flickering shadows across the stone walls of the watchtower. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind the scent of damp earth and pine, but the storm between Rowan and Cassian was far from over. They sat on opposite sides of the small room, neither speaking, neither able to look away. The air between them was suffocating, thick with everything unsaid, with everything that had just happened. Cassian could still feel the ghost of Rowan's lips against his, the heat of his hands gripping his waist, the way he had kissed him like it was both a promise and a warning. And now, silence. Rowan leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his gaze unreadable. His damp tunic clung to his frame, his dark hair curling slightly from the rain. He looked dangerous like this, like something Cassian should stay far, far away from. And yet, Cassian had never wanted anything more. "You're staring," Rowan muttered without looking up. Cassian smirked, leaning back against the wooden floor. "Maybe I like what I see." Rowan let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "You have no idea what you're playing with." Cassian tilted his head, eyes gleaming. "Then teach me." Rowan's gaze snapped to his, something dark flickering behind those stormy eyes. A challenge. A warning. Cassian knew he was pushing, knew he was tempting fate. But after everything, the war, the blood, the betrayal, he wanted this. Needed it. Rowan pushed off the wall in one fluid movement, crossing the small space between them in an instant. He didn't stop until he was standing over Cassian, his body blocking out the firelight. Cassian refused to look away, refused to back down. "You think this is a game?" Rowan murmured, voice low, dangerous. Cassian's heart hammered, but he held his ground. "Isn't it?" Rowan's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You want to play, Cassian?" Before Cassian could answer, Rowan reached down, grabbing his wrist and yanking him up in one swift motion. Cassian barely had time to catch his breath before he was pressed against the stone wall, Rowan's body mere inches from his. Every muscle in Cassian's body tensed, but not from fear. From something far worse. Far more intoxicating. Rowan leaned in, so close that his breath ghosted over Cassian's skin. "You don't know what you're asking for." Cassian swallowed hard. "Then show me." Rowan's eyes darkened, something snapping inside of him. In one swift movement, he pinned Cassian's hands above his head, pressing their bodies together. Cassian sucked in a sharp breath. The heat, the tension, it was unbearable. "You think you can tease me?" Rowan murmured, his lips brushing against Cassian's ear. "That you can push me without consequences?" Cassian shivered, his body betraying him. "Maybe I want the consequences." Rowan let out a low growl, a warning, a challenge. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The fire crackled behind them, the wind howling through the cracks in the stone. Then, just as quickly as he had moved, Rowan stepped back. Cassian almost stumbled forward at the sudden loss of warmth. Rowan's breathing was unsteady, his jaw clenched. "Get some rest. We leave at dawn." Cassian stared at him, chest rising and falling, his pulse still thrumming wildly. Rowan turned away, but not before Cassian caught it, the flicker of hesitation, of restraint. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And Cassian wasn't going to let Rowan run from it forever. The journey back to the capital was long, treacherous, and filled with more unspoken words than Cassian could handle. Rowan was different now, colder, more controlled. It was as if whatever had sparked between them in the watchtower had burned too brightly, forcing Rowan to smother it before it consumed them both. Cassian hated it. The city gates loomed before them, banners of the royal crest snapping in the wind. The scent of burning wood and damp stone filled the air, and despite the supposed safety of their arrival, Cassian knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning. The streets were eerily silent. The people had gathered near the palace square, where an execution platform had been raised. Cassian's stomach twisted. He knew who it was meant for. Rowan's grip tightened on the reins of his horse. "Stay close," he murmured. Cassian didn't answer. He didn't need to. They passed through the crowd unnoticed, the weight of what was coming pressing down on them both. The tension between them had shifted. It was no longer just personal. This was about power. About survival. About choosing. The palace gates were wide open, an invitation, or a trap. Inside, the grand hall was filled with nobles, warriors, and those who had once pledged loyalty to the crown. At the center of it all sat the queen, draped in gold, her expression unreadable. But it was the man kneeling before her, shackled and beaten, that made Cassian stop breathing. His brother. The queen's voice rang out, sharp and merciless. "Cassian Hale, you returned just in time to witness justice." Cassian's blood ran cold. This wasn't justice. This was a message. Rowan's hand brushed against his, just barely, but the touch grounded him. A silent question. Cassian exhaled slowly. Then, he stepped forward. "Justice." His voice didn't waver. Or fear. The queen tilted her head. "You dare question my rule?" Cassian smiled, a dangerous, knowing smile. "Always." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Rowan tensed beside him. The queen's lips curled. "Then prove your loyalty, Cassian. Kill him." Silence. Cassian's pulse thundered in his ears. His brother looked up, bruised and bloody but still defiant. The weight of everyone's gaze pressed down on him, waiting. Expecting. He could feel Rowan beside him, his presence like a shadow at his back. If Cassian made the wrong choice now, neither of them would leave this palace alive. The queen raised a dagger, extending it toward him. Cassian took it. A breath. A heartbeat. A decision. Then, chaos. Cassian spun, driving the dagger not into his brother, but into the queen's outstretched hand. A scream. Guards lunged forward. Rowan was already moving, his sword flashing in the firelight. Cassian grabbed his brother, yanking him to his feet. "Run." The palace erupted into madness. Steel clashed, shouts rang out, and the world became a blur of blood and fire. Cassian barely registered the pain as a blade grazed his arm. He only focused on Rowan. Rowan, who had always been a warrior, a storm in human form. Rowan, who was now fighting his way toward him. Cassian caught his gaze across the chaos. Something unspoken passed between them. A promise. Then, together they ran. Through the corridors, through the gates, through the city streets. The sky burned behind them, the palace a beacon of destruction. The queen's rule had shattered. But the war was just beginning. As they reached the river's edge, Cassian turned back, breathless, heart racing. Rowan stood beside him, equally ragged, equally alive. For the first time, Cassian allowed himself to hope. Rowan met his gaze, a ghost of a smirk playing at his lips. "You always did like to start fires, Hale." Cassian grinned. "You always did like to put them out." Rowan stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Not this one." Cassian swallowed. The war had begun, the city was burning, and the world was changing. But here, in this moment, Rowan chose him. And Cassian? He chose Rowan right back.